Next up here, we got basically gluten. Okay? Celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, putting those two together here. Basically, we're talking about gluten. Everybody, gluten. What is it? It's just a protein found in the vast majority of grains, found in many grains. And I have a list, I believe, here in a second that kind of shows off some of those. But if you have a gluten sensitivity or if you suffer from celiac disease, especially, you definitely know which of these grains have gluten in it and which ones do not. And gluten, does provide texture, it does provide shape. So, it is something that can provide. And if you've ever eaten gluten-free crust per se, then gluten-free crust tastes a heck of a lot different than non-gluten-free crust, right? So it does provide texture, shape, and it does have a slightly different, more palatable taste to some people. For individuals where gluten cannot be absorbed, this is celiac disease, and this is inheritance. This is going to be a genetic thing, right? But this is where the protein gluten cannot be absorbed at all. For individuals who have some gluten sensitivity, we'll talk about that here in a second. It's a little bit different, semantics sometimes, but there is a distinct difference here. The gluten protein cannot be absorbed at all. It results in some pretty severe signs and symptoms, at least from a quality of life standpoint. And ultimately, it can lead to some significant malnutrition because it does cause swelling and inflammation, which can damage structures within the small intestine, leading to poor absorption of nutrients. So when we look at some signs and symptoms here of it, abdominal bloating, chronic diarrhea, weight loss, poor growth, abdominal bloating, you're going to feel swollen, right? And you're not going to want to eat certain foods. And if you feel really swollen, you're not going to feel like you need to eat as much anyway. Chronic diarrhea, there's your pretty significant malnutrition. You are swiftly moving contents from the small into the large intestine and then into the rectum and obviously with the bowel movement. There's going to be some pretty significant weight loss here. As stuff is quickly moving through, it's not going through at a nice slow pace where you can absorb the stuff, the nutrients naturally. Okay, so there's going to be some inherent weight loss with here. If this is a child, it can result in some pretty significant poor growth patterns, which is not ideal. Blood tests to diagnose, an intestinal biopsy to diagnose the disease for celiac, that's how you do it. And for these individuals who truly have celiac disease, a gluten-free diet needs to be followed, okay, for these individuals. Okay? There's no way around it for them. They just can't do it. Some foods to avoid: barley, rye, anything with wheat in it, wheat enriched flour, wheat bran, wheat germ, cracked wheat, wheat protein. So any type of wheat product is going to have gluten in it. Some foods that are there's other things. There's also, I think, triticale, durum flour, gram flour, semolina flour, farina. There are a number of other things to avoid. I just put the three kind of biggest ones there. Stuff that's generally safe: flaxseed is generally considered safe. Buckwheat, flax, millet, quinoa. Okay, flax, and quinoa, oats, soy. These are generally the most common things that people consume a lot more. Obviously, corn, I guess, is something that people consume a hell of a lot of as well. Okay, but as you can see, there are a number of common foods that are generally safe that can be utilized as well. Tapioca, rice, nuts, millet, buckwheat, cassava, sorghum, arrowroot. All of these things are generally considered safe. I may ask one or two of them on an exam. Anything wheat, as you can kind of see, good gravy. Anything wheat in front of it is a food to avoid. When it comes to gluten sensitivity, the major difference is, there's some bloating, there's some diarrhea, but there's also some potential constipation and nausea associated with this as well. The big difference is that there is no damage to the small intestine. Does not have damage to the small intestine. Where gluten, or I'm sorry, where celiac disease, you do see swelling, inflammation, damage. That is the massive difference between these. Obviously, you know, gluten-free foods have come a long way, to be honest. In the very beginning, you know, in the early 2000s, it was eating cardboard, basically. And now, you know, there's a lot of wonderfully tasty stuff, cauliflower-based stuff. Super good. Get hungry just thinking about it. And in 2013, the FDA, adopted a gluten-free labeling standard. So there is a gluten-free labeling standard. If you're curious about it, there's the website to the U.S. FDA's website on gluten-free labeling, because it is pretty extensive. It's all based on, it has to contain less than 20 parts per million to be considered gluten-free. It's also gluten-free if it doesn't contain any wheat, rye, or barley, right? Or any kind of crossbreeds with those, which is just kind of a CYA type of terminology there. Any ingredient that's derived from wheat, rye, or barley that has not been processed. If it has been processed, and it has gone through the processing to remove gluten. So if it's something that's been processed and gluten's been removed, that can still be labeled as gluten-free. It just has to be under that 20 parts per million. So even if it is something that is traditionally associated with gluten, i.e. foods to avoid, if it has been processed and gluten's been removed, it has to still contain less than 20 parts per million to be considered gluten-free. And on the website, they go into the much more, there's a whole bunch of minutia there associated with it. So if you are curious, click on the link right here, okay? And go get yourself some knowledge. Have some fun. Gluten-free diets have been shown to be pretty beneficial when it comes to autism or autism spectrum disorders. Autism spectrum disorders, or autism, they are just neurological development disorders, okay? And it can vary quite a bit. There can be some very, very, very severe deficits in like social interaction or verbal and nonverbal communication. There can be mild deficits in that, okay? So, it is a spectrum. It is all over the board when it comes to this, but it is a collection of social interaction issues, verbal or nonverbal communication issues, repetitive behaviors, interest. And that seems really weird. I have a nephew who's somewhere on the autism spectrum. And he had, what kid doesn't love dinosaurs? My kids both loved them. And for the most part, they still do. But when it comes to children who have an autism spectrum disorder, the interest is much more intense. They know pretty much everything forwards and backwards. This little nephew knew how to say all the names for all these dinosaurs and knew what they all were. It was pretty amazing. Okay? I'm not saying that's good or bad, to be honest, but they just have this intense interest. What causes these things? Not getting into that, but there are environmental, there are genetic factors as well. We can go down a rabbit hole later with that. I don't want to touch it. But it has been shown that gluten-free and casein-free, and casein is a protein that we find in milks and whatnot, that gluten-free and casein diets can help. Here is a link to an article. I can't remember the name of this. I think that's the name of the study right there, but it's from Penn State. And this was done in 2012. This was a study that was published in 2012, February of 2012. And it found that a gluten-free, casein-free diet may lead to improvements in behavior and psychological symptoms in children diagnosed with ASD. And the reason why I include this, not only, I mean, 1 in 68 children have autism or have autism spectrum disorder. So, I mean, that's a pretty significant number. But this was the first survey to really document from a parent standpoint, them looking at this diet, them living with these children every single day, seeing the improvement that they were able to have with this gluten-free, casein-free diet. What the health, I believe, it's kind of sensationalized. It is very sensationalized, to be honest. We could go through and probably poke holes all over the place in it. But it did show some pretty interesting things, sans the sensationalism. And one of them, I believe that was the video that looked at children with autism, looked at a couple different children with autism on 2 different variations. One was verbal and one was nonverbal, basically, or not very verbal. And they cleaned up their diets, took out all the processed stuff, and just the sheer, huge, massive difference in their mannerisms and how they interacted with the world around them. Vastly, vastly, vastly different. That's anecdotal. I get it. You're just seeing a couple individuals. This is a study to kind of back up what that little thing or what that little video showed. So if you you do know someone who has autism, saying, hey, there's this diet thingy that you might want to check out, and here you go. Here's the link. Most parents with children in the autism spectrum know of it, and hopefully have been trying to do as best they can to do a gluten-free, casein-free diet for